The crash of a lantern hitting the floorboards was what woke Reuben Rhodes from the half-sleep of a man who had ridden 40 miles since dawn, and he was off his bedroll with a knife in his hand before the sound had finished rolling through the cabin. "Don't move," he said, low and hard, the voice of a man who had spent 9 years alone in the high country above Iron Joe Pass and had learned that a calm voice carried further than a shout. "I've got a blade, and I know this room better than you do in the dark." The shape by his shelf of tinned goods froze, and then, instead of the whimper he expected, a woman's voice answered him, steady despite the shake in it. "I am not here to rob you, Mr. Rhodes. I need your bandages, your whiskey if you have it, and your horse, and I need them faster than I need to explain myself. So if you would be so kind as to light that lamp instead of standing there deciding whether to gut me. A man is dying not 4 miles from this cabin." He struck a match one-handed, the flare of it throwing gold across the room, and found himself looking at a woman he had never seen in his life. Dark hair come loose from its pins, a split lip, mud to her knees, and absurdly, a woven basket clutched against her hip, as though her life depended on it as much as the man she claimed was dying. She was young, not much past 25, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome rather than pretty, all sharp cheekbones and steady gray eyes that did not waver from his even though he stood a full head taller than her and outweighed her by better than 100 pounds of muscle earned hauling mail sacks and felled timber through mountain winters. "Who is dying?" Reuben said. "And who are you?" "Edith Barrett," she said. "I am assistant to Silas Cobb, the surveyor. Do you know that name?" The knife in his hand dropped an inch. "Silas Cobb taught me to read a compass when I was 14 years old and thought I knew these mountains better than God did. Where is he?" "In a line shack above Widow Creek, shot through the side, and if I do not get back to him with something to stop the bleeding before this candle end burns down, he will not see morning." She said it plainly without tears, though he could see now that her hands trembled faintly, setting the basket down on his table, careful as a woman setting down a sleeping child. "I found your cabin by luck and lantern light. I am sorry for breaking your window latch. I will pay for it." Reuben was already pulling on his boots. "You'll pay for it by telling me who shot him while I saddle the horse." She looked at him for one long moment, gray eyes measuring him the way a surveyor measures a slope before committing a mule to the climb, and something in what she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and reached for her basket again. "You do not need to carry that," he said. "I carry it everywhere," she answered, and there was a flash of something fierce and half-embarrassed in her voice that he did not understand yet and would not until much later, when he had come to know exactly what those eggs meant to a woman who had buried every home she'd ever built. "It will not slow me down, Mr. Rhodes. Saddle your horse." He saddled the horse. They rode out into a night gone dry and starlit, the kind of clear black sky that came with drought years, when the clouds forgot the country existed, and every creek bed in the territory had shrunk to a trickle or a memory. Reuben had ridden this stretch of ground 1,000 times, carrying mail between Fort Benton and the scattered outposts north of Iron Joe Pass, was the only man on contract fool enough to take the route in a bad year, and he used that knowledge now, cutting through a dry wash that shaved 20 minutes off the trail a stranger would have taken. Edith rode behind him on his second horse, keeping pace without complaint, the basket somehow still balanced against her body, wrapped now in her shawl, and he found himself glancing back twice, not to check on her but to check on the basket, baffled by his own curiosity. They found the line shack by the smell of it before they saw it, blood and burnt tallow and old man's sweat, and Silas Cobb was exactly as bad as she had said, gray in the face, a wadded shirt gone dark and stiff against his side. But his eyes came open when Reuben knelt beside him, and his cracked lips pulled into something that might have been the ghost of the grin Reuben remembered from a boy's first mail route 20 years past. "Rube Rhodes," Cobb rasped. "Grew into your shoulders, I see." "Hold still, old man." Reuben was already cutting away the shirt, his big hands moving with a gentleness that surprised even him, the same care he gave to a foaling mare or a bird with a broken wing. Edith crouched on the other side, unrolling bandages from a saddlebag with hands that did not shake now, matching him motion for motion, and he understood in that moment that whatever else this woman was, she was not the sort who fainted or fled from blood. "Won't matter," Cobb said. "Feel it in my chest now, boy, not just my side. Listen to me before I go soft in the head." His hand found Reuben's wrist and gripped it with a strength that seemed to cost him everything he had left. "Vane's men did this, Cyrus Vane. He's been moving survey stakes on the water claims up along the coulee, buying off my second man to file false lines, and when I would not sign the papers his lawyer sent, he had me shot and my satchel taken. Edith got the true maps out. She's got them now, sewn into her coat. I know Vane's name," Reuben said. "Runs cattle south of the post, been buying up half the territory since the railroad man came through in the spring." "He means to have the rest of it," Cobb said, "and he means to have the coolie's water most of all, because there is no other spring for 30 miles that will not run dry this year, and the railroad will pay him a fortune for a right-of-way that runs straight through Larson's land if Larson's people are run off it first. There is a herd missing from the post's grazing lease, Rube. Vane's men took it themselves and drove it to lay a false trail toward Larson's coulee, so the blame falls on the Norwegians and not on him. I have the true trail marked. It goes north and east, not south toward the coulee at all." Oft, and the sound of it was wet and terrible, and Edith's hand found his other one and held it. "Edith, promise me." "I already promised you twice tonight, Silas. Promise him too." Cobb's eyes moved to Reuben, and there was something pleading in them now beneath the pain. "She cannot do this alone, and God knows I taught you the pass so you could carry more than the mail through it. Get those maps to the land office in Fort Benton. Clear the coolie's name before Vane forces them off that water. Will you do it?" Reuben looked at the old man who had once ridden beside him for a full winter, teaching him which draws held snow long enough to kill a horse and which ones cleared by March, and he thought of nothing else to say but the truth. "I'll see it done, Silas. You have my word." Silas Cobb died a little before the sky began to gray in the east, quietly, with Edith's hand still in his and Reuben's coat laid over him against a cold that had nothing left to do to him. Edith did not cry until it was over, and then she cried only for a minute, hard and silent, before she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and began, without being asked, to fold the bloodied bandages into a neat pile as though tidiness were the only mercy left to offer a dead man. Reuben watched her do it and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, something that had nothing to do with the promise he had just made and everything to do with the set of her jaw as she worked. They buried Silas Cobb in the hard, dry ground above Widow Creek, because there was no way to carry him the 2 days to Fort Benton in that heat, without the drought turning it into a worse business than it already was. And Reuben built the marker himself out of 2 lengths of lodgepole pine, lashed with rawhide. And Edith stood beside the grave afterward with her basket held against her chest, and said words her father used to say over the graves of livestock and neighbors both. Back on the Kansas farm that had failed her family in a drought not so different from this one. "You lost a farm to a dry year," Reuben said. "It was not a question." Something in the way she looked at the cracked earth told him. "When I was 19, she said. My father is buried on land that belongs to a bank in Topeka now. I do not intend to lose another home to a man's greed if I can help it, Mr. Rhodes, drought or no drought." She looked at him then, gray eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You may call me Edith. I think we are past Mr. Rhodes and Miss Barrett after a night like this one." "Reuben," he said. "Reuben," she said, testing the name, and something in her shoulders eased a fraction, the first sign of softness he had seen in her since the lantern shattered on his floor. They rode back to his cabin because there was nowhere else for her to go, no safe way to reach the post before dark with Vane's men somewhere on the same ground. And Edith did not argue about propriety the way he half expected a woman fresh from the East might. Only asked, practical as a soldier, where she might set her basket where it would not chill in the night. Reuben found her a spot near the hearth stones and, watching her arrange it there with the same careful precision she had used on the bandages, finally asked the question that had been needling him since she'd walked out of the dark with it clutched to her ribs. "What is in the basket, Edith, that a woman would carry it into a stranger's cabin at midnight instead of leaving it behind?" She was quiet a moment, turning one of the eggs gently between her palms, checking its warmth against her wrist the way he had seen women check a baby's fever. 11 eggs, she said finally. "My hen went broody on the trail 3 weeks past, and I do not know one thing about surveying that I did not learn from Sela's cob, but I know how to keep a clutch of eggs from dying, because I raised chickens from the time I was 6 years old until the bank took the last of them along with everything else my family owned. The hen died of the heat 2 days ago, and I have been keeping these eggs warm against my own body since, wrapped in wool, turned by hand, because I decided somewhere on this fool's errand of a survey job that I was not going to arrive wherever I finally land with nothing of my own. Even if it is only 11 eggs and a basket, Reuben Rhodes, it will be something that is mine, something I built instead of something a man took from me." He did not laugh at her, though he could see in the wary set of her mouth that she had braced for it. Instead, he found himself crouching by the hearth, studying the eggs with the same seriousness he gave to a bad stretch of trail. "They'll want steadier heat than your own 2 hands can give them through a night," he said. "I've got scrap lumber and an old tin box behind the shed. Give me until morning." By first light he had built her a crude warming box lined with wool batting and set close enough to the banked coals to hold a gentle heat through the night, with a little door cut in the side so she could turn the eggs without letting the warmth escape. And when Edith Barrett saw it sitting finished on his table, she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him in a way that made a man twice his size feel about 10 feet tall. "It is not a proper coop," Reuben said, suddenly awkward under that look, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just something to get them through till you've got a real place to raise them." "It is more than most men would think to do," Edith said, and that was the first time he heard her laugh, short and surprised, as if the sound had caught her off guard as much as it caught him. The ride into Cutbank Post 2 days later should have been a simple matter of reporting a death, and a crime to men who could do something about it. And Reuben Rhodes had made that ride 100 times in every season the mountains could throw at a man. But he had never made it with a woman beside him whose satchel held maps that could ruin the richest man for 200 miles, and he felt the difference in every mile of it. Otis Granger ran the post the way his father had before him, a low log building with a plank porch that served as store, tavern, and unofficial courthouse for every dispute between the post and Larson's coulee, and every homestead scattered across that dry basin. And he came out from behind his counter with his hand already extended before Reuben had finished tying off the horses. "Rube, heard you came through at a dead run past the Hendricks place, figured something was wrong." Then he saw Edith, and his open face went careful in the particular way of a man used to reading trouble before it announced itself. "Ma'am, this is Edith Barrett," Reuben said, "Sela's Cobb's assistant." "Otis, Sela's is dead. Vane's men shot him for what he found on his survey." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it, and Otis Granger's wife Millie came out from the back room drying her hands on her apron, and by the time Reuben and Edith had told the whole of it, laid out on the counter alongside the corner of one map Edith dared to show them, there were a dozen people crowded into the store who had come in for flour and coffee and stayed for something far more dangerous. That was Reuben's first mistake, though he would not see it as one until later, because among that crowd was a thin, quick-eyed man named Deller who clerked part-time for Cyrus Vane and rode back out within the hour to carry every word of it south. Cyrus Vane arrived at Cutbank Post the following afternoon with 4 riders, and the particular calm of a man who had never once in his life expected to be told no, and he found Reuben and Edith still there, going over Cobb's true survey lines at Otis Granger's kitchen table, and he did not bother dismounting before he began to talk. "I hear there's a dead man's business being spread around my range," Vane called from the porch, loud enough to draw every eye on the yard, "and a woman claiming I had a hand in it. I'll thank you to step out here, Miss Barrett, and say it to my face instead of Otis Granger's counter." Edith went out onto the porch with her chin level and her satchel left deliberately behind, and Reuben came out a half-step behind her shoulder, close enough that Vane's eyes flicked to him and narrowed. "I have not accused you of anything I cannot prove, Mr. Vane," Edith said. "Silas Cobb's true survey shows the missing herd's trail running north and east of the grazing lease, not south toward Larson's coulee. Someone drove those cattle that way to lay blame where it did not belong, and someone shot Mr. Cobb rather than let that be known." "That is a serious thing to say about a man in front of his neighbors," Vane said, and though his voice stayed pleasant, there was iron underneath it now. "A drifting surveyor's assistant and a male rider who talks to more grizzly bears than white men most winters, coming into town with a dead man's papers, and a story that just happens to point the finger everywhere, but at the poor Norwegian farmers who have been squatting on water that rightly belongs to the Grazing Association. I'd be careful, Miss Barrett, accusing a man of murder with nothing but a piece of paper you could have drawn up yourselves." A murmur went through the yard, uneasy, and Reuben watched with a slow-burning anger as he saw doubt take root in faces that had known him 20 years. Saw Otis Granger's jaw tight with the effort of staying neutral in his own doorway. This was Vane's true weapon. Reuben understood then, not his hired guns but this, the slow poisoning of a town's good sense with fear and suggestion, and there was no blow Reuben could land with his fists that would undo it. "Silas Cobb taught half the riders on this route everything they know," Reuben said, and his voice, when he raised it, carried the way it did through mountain passes, deep and unhurried and impossible to talk over. "He rode mail through Ironjaw Pass for 11 years before his leg gave out, and he took up surveying instead. And there is not a man in this yard who did not owe him a debt at one time or another. He is dead, shot in the side and left to bleed out in a lined shack, and I intend to see whoever did that answer for it, whether that trail leads to you, Cyrus, or to your hired men or clean out of this territory. That is not a story. That is a promise I made a dying man, and I do not break my word." Vane's eyes stayed on him a long moment, and something calculating moved behind them. "Careful, Rhodes. A man who spends that much time alone in the mountains starts believing his own word carries more weight down here than it does. I'd hate to see the post decide it can't trust its mail carried by a man harboring accused liars." He turned his horse. "Think on that, Otis. Think on who's been good to this town and who blew in on a dead man's coattails." He rode out with his 4 men, and the silence he left behind him was worse than any shouting, because Reuben could see in the faces around him that the seed had already taken. It did not take Vane long to make the town choose. Within a week, 2 families who had always welcomed Reuben's mail deliveries with coffee and gossip turned cool and short with him, and the Post's Grazing Association, which held the contract for his route, sent word through Otis that they were considering putting the mail out to bid come spring, seeing as some folks felt uneasy about who Reuben Rhodes had taken to keeping company with. Edith bore the worst of it, called a railroad spy in one breath and a fortune huntress in the next. Her presence at Reuben's cabin whispered about by women who had never laid eyes on her. And though she held her chin high through all of it, Reuben saw the toll it took, the new quiet that came over her some evenings when she thought he wasn't watching. "I have cost you your town," she said one night, sitting across the hearth from him with the warming box between them, checking the eggs by rote now, a ritual that had become as natural to her hands as breathing. "Your root, your neighbors. Everything you built up here alone, I have put a crack through it in 2 weeks. Wasn't much of a town to begin with if it turns on a man over gossip that fast," Reuben said, though the words cost him more than he let show. "Besides, You didn't put the crack in it, Edith. Vane did. I've known that man was rotten for 3 years, ever since he tried to buy out old Hendrix's water rights for 1/10 what they were worth, and had his boys burn a barn when Hendrix wouldn't sell. Nobody wanted to say it out loud because nobody wanted to be the next barn. He looked at her over the low fire. Silas said it plain enough. He was killed for telling the truth. I don't aim to let that truth die with him just because some folks would rather keep quiet and keep their peace. Why do you live so far from all of them then? Edith asked, and there was no accusation in it, only genuine wanting to know, if the town means so little and the mountains mean so much. Reuben was quiet a while, turning that question over the way he turned over trail decisions, careful of loose rock. I had a wife, he said finally. Long time ago now, before I took up the mail route. She died of a fever the second winter we were married, out on a claim we'd staked near Fort Benton, and there wasn't a doctor within 2 days' ride, and I couldn't get her to one in time no matter how hard I rode. I came up into these mountains after that because there wasn't a soul down there that didn't look at me with pity in their eyes, and I found I could stand my own company better than that. Silas is the only one who ever came looking for me on purpose instead of needing the mail delivered. Guess that's part of why I gave him my word so easy. He was about the only family I had left. Edith did not offer him pity, which he was grateful for, only reached across the small space between them and set her hand briefly over his, rough and warm from the fire. Then we will finish what he started, she said, and you will have earned your place back down there if you still want it. And if you do not want it, Reuben Rhodes, I think you will find you are not quite so alone up here as you have made yourself believe. He looked at her hand on his and felt something in his chest crack open that had been sealed shut a long time, and neither of them moved to pull away for a long moment, the fire popping softly, the eggs in their warming box ticking faintly as she told him they sometimes did when the chicks inside stirred. They took to watching the ridge above the cabin in shifts after that, alternating nights, since word had come through a Larson's coolie boy that Vane's riders had been seen scouting the high trail more than once, and it was during those long watches, wrapped in blankets against a night gone bitter with the drought's strange cold snaps, that the rest of it came out between them, the guarded truths neither had meant to share so soon. Edith told him about the bank agent who had come to their Kansas farm with papers already signed against her father's name, about her mother's death the winter after, about the years she had spent keeping house for an aunt in Ohio who called her too willful to marry well, before Silas Cobb had answered her letter asking for surveying work and given her, for the first time since she was 19, a reason to believe she might build something of her own instead of watching everything be taken. Reuben told her about the winter his wife died, about the year after that he could barely remember through drink and grief, about how Silas Cobb had ridden up into these very mountains and sat with him 3 days without saying a single word about God or moving on or getting over it, just split wood alongside him until Reuben had wept it out on his own time. He had a way of making a person feel like their grief was not something to be hurried past, Edith said quietly, watching the stars wheel slow overhead. I am glad he found you when he did. I am glad he sent you to find me, Reuben said, and it was the first thing close to a confession either of them had spoken, and Edith did not look away from it. It was on one of those cold, clear-eyed nights of watching that they finally rode out together to trace the true trail Cobb's maps had marked, wanting proof solid enough to carry to the land office themselves rather than rely on a dead man's word alone. And it was there, in a dry coulee 2 hours north of the grazing lease, that they found the herd, thin and dust-caked, penned behind a hasty brush fence in a hollow no honest drover would have chosen, watched over by 2 of Vane's riders playing cards beside a low fire. Reuben and Edith had gotten close enough on foot, belly down along the ridge with a borrowed spyglass, to count the brands plain as day, post-grazing association stock, when a dislodged stone gave them away, and the two riders came up shooting before either of them had a chance to explain themselves as anything but trespassers on stolen ground. "Down the slope now," Reuben said, and did not wait to see if she obeyed before he was moving, catching her arm and hauling her bodily behind an outcrop of rimrock, as a bullet chewed splinters off the stone a foot from where her head had been an instant before. His heart was hammering in a way it had not since the war of his younger years, not from fear of the bullets, but from the pure animal terror of what one of them finding its mark in her would mean. And he put himself between Edith and the shooters without a single thought toward whether that was the wisest tactic, only that it was the only one his body would allow. "I have a pistol, Reuben. I am not made of glass," Edith snapped, and even pinned down with lead cracking off rock above their heads, there was steel enough in her voice to almost make him smile. "Then use it and cover me," he said, "because I am going to circle round through that draw and come up behind them, and I would rather not do it with a bullet in my back." She did exactly that, calm as a woman shelling peas, firing careful shots to keep the two riders pinned behind their own brush fence, while Reuben worked his way through a dry wash choked with sage. And when he came up on the pair from behind, it was his size and not his gun that ended it, hauling one man bodily off his feet and into the dirt before the fellow could bring his rifle to bear, while the second, seeing the fight already lost, threw his hands up rather than test his luck against a man built like a granite outcrop. It was Edith, though, climbing down from the ridge with her pistol still drawn and her hands rock steady, who thought to search the men's saddlebags and found, tucked inside an oilskin wrap, a letter in Cyrus Vane's own hand instructing his foreman on exactly where the herd was to be driven, and precisely which false trail was to be left for anyone who came looking, proof so damning that even Vane's money would struggle to bury it. "You saved my life up there," Reuben said afterward, once the two riders were bound and the herd's true brands recorded in Edith's surveyor's notebook, his voice rough with the aftershock of how close that first bullet had come. "Pinned them down long enough I didn't take one between the shoulder blades." "You saved mine first, pulling me behind that rock," Edith said. "I would say that makes us square, Reuben Rhodes, except I suspect this is only the beginning of the debt we are running up with each other, and I find I do not mind that in the least." They brought the two captured riders and the letter back not to Cutbank Post but past it, riding 2 hard days toward Fort Benton, where a federal land office kept an agent named Thomas Dunmore who had no particular love for Cyrus Vane's growing influence over the territory's water claims, but word of what they carried outran them, because the second rider, given a chance to talk in exchange for leniency, sent a boy ahead with a message to Vane before Reuben ever thought to silence him. And by the time they returned to Cutbank Post to gather more evidence and rally what allies they could before pressing on, Cyrus Vane had decided that whatever hesitation had held his hand before was no longer a luxury he could afford. He came for them on the 4th night after that, and he came in force, 7 riders under cover of a moonless sky, meaning to burn Reuben's cabin to the ground with the maps and the letter and anyone fool enough to be standing in it. They had warning only because Reuben's years alone in that country had taught him to listen to the mountain the way other men listen to a clock, and it was Edith, on watch at the small hour when most men's eyes grow heavy, who first caught the wrongness in a night bird's silence and woke him with a hand clamped hard over his shoulder. "Riders," she whispered. "More than 2. Coming up slow from the south trail." Reuben was on his feet and moving before the word was finished leaving her mouth, years of instinct taking over, and what followed was not panic but the swift, practiced calculation of a man who had spent a decade reading terrain for a living. "We can't hold here against 7 with 2 rifles and a pistol," he said, already pulling on his boots, mind racing through every fold of ground he knew within a mile of that cabin. "But they don't know this ground like I do, and they'll expect us to run for the post." "Then we do not run for the post," Edith said, already gathering the satchel of maps and, without a word of apology for it, the basket with its 11 eggs, now nearing 3 weeks warm and precious past any reasoning she could have given a stranger. "There's an old trapper's dugout half a mile up the north draw," Reuben said. "Otis knows it. If I can get a signal fire lit on the ridge above it, he'll see it from the post same as he'd see smoke from a chimney, and he's got 6 men there who'd stand with us if they knew the truth of it plain instead of Vane's poison. I need 10 minutes to lay a false trail south before we cut north, make them think we've run for the low country. Then let us not waste the 9 minutes we have left arguing about it," Edith said, and swung up onto her horse. What followed was the most dangerous hour either of them had lived through, riding south along the open trail long enough to leave clear sign in the dust, before doubling back through a rocky streambed that left no track at all, then climbing hard and silent through timber toward the old dugout well, behind them, the sound of Vane's riders converging on the empty cabin carried faint and furious on the night air. Reuben got the signal fire lit on the ridge with hands that did not shake despite the danger. 3 quick flares of pitch pine set at intervals the way he and Otis had agreed on years before as a distress call for exactly this kind of trouble, though neither man had ever truly believed they would need it. Vane's men found the cabin empty, and in their fury, did exactly what Vane had ordered, put a torch to it, and Reuben watched from the ridge as the small home he had built with his own hands over 9 solitary years went up in flame and felt something clean and cold settle over his anger. Because a man who would burn an empty cabin out of spite was a man who had already shown the world exactly what he was. It was Edith who caught the shape of it first, though, watching the riders mill in confusion around the burning wreck. "They think we are still south," she said. "If Otis is coming, he needs to come from the north, catch them from behind while they are watching that fire and congratulating themselves." Otis Granger's riders arrived not 40 minutes later, having ridden hard the moment they saw the signal, and it was the strangest battle Reuben ever took part in. No great gunfight, but a swift, chaotic scramble in firelight and shadow, as 6 ranch hands and shopkeepers who had known Reuben Rhodes their whole lives came down on Vane's men from an angle they never expected, shouting and firing into the air more than at any man. Until the element of surprise alone was enough to send 3 of Vane's riders fleeing into the dark, and the rest throwing down their arms rather than be caught burning an innocent man's home to the ground in front of witnesses who would not forget it. Cyrus Vane himself was not among the riders that night, having stayed at his own ranch to keep his hands clean, but the letter in his handwriting and the testimony of 2 captured men, added now to the 4 caught at the cabin fire, was more than enough for Thomas Dunmore's federal warrant when it finally arrived from Fort Benton 5 days later, and Vane was taken from his own porch in front of his own hired men, his empire of fear collapsing as swiftly as it had been built. Reuben stood at the edge of what had been his cabin the morning after the fire, looking at the blackened stones of his hearth, the ruin of 9 years' work reduced to ash and char, and felt Edith come to stand beside him rather than behind him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "I am sorry," she said. "This is truly my fault now. Whatever you say about Vane, it was my satchel that brought this down on you." "You are wrong about that same as before," Reuben said, and turned to look at her properly, taking in the soot on her cheek, the steadiness that had not left her eyes even after a night like the one behind them. "This cabin kept me alive and kept me hid from the world for 9 years, Edith, and I built it because I did not think there was a single soul left who I wanted to let past my own front step. It burned down protecting a promise I made to the only man who ever came looking for me on purpose, and it burned down with you standing beside me instead of some stranger I never let close enough to matter. I don't mourn it. I'll build another. Better this time because I've got someone worth building it for." Edith went very still. "Reuben Rhodes, are you telling me you mean to stay in these mountains and rebuild, when the whole territory now knows your name and half of it, at least, is finally willing to give you the credit you deserve?" "I'm telling you," Reuben said, "that I don't much care where I build it, so long as you're planning on being somewhere nearby when I do. I've spent a long while thinking the mountains were the only thing that never left a man. Turns out I was wrong about that, too." She did not answer him with words. She rose up on her toes, careful of the cinders still smoking around their boots, and kissed him, brief and searching and warm despite the cold gray morning. And Reuben Rhodes, who had faced down grizzlies and blizzards and armed men without his pulse so much as stumbling, felt his knees go weak as a colt's under the weight of it. "That," Edith said, pulling back just far enough to look up at him, cheeks flushed beneath the soot, "is for pulling me behind that rock when the bullets started flying, and for building me a warming box out of scrap tin the first night we met, and for a great many other things I have been meaning to thank you for properly since Widow Creek." "I could get used to that kind of thanks," Reuben said, and kissed her again, this time with no interruption from cinders or grief or armed men to hurry them along. And above them, the smoke from the ruined cabin drifted thin and pale into a sky that, for the first time in weeks, held the faint gray promise of coming snow. The eggs, tucked safe the whole night through inside a saddlebag Edith had refused to leave behind even amid gunfire and burning timber, hatched 11 days later, all 11 of them, in the loft of Otis Granger's barn where Reuben and Edith had been given shelter through the worst of that first snow. And there was something almost holy in the small gray room that night, lantern light low, both of them crouched over a nest of straw watching damp. Exhausted chicks worked their way free of shells that had traveled farther and through more danger than most grown men ever saw in a lifetime. 11, Edith said, voice thick, cradling the last and smallest of them in her cupped palms as it dried fluffy and gold in the lantern's warmth. "Every one of them made it, Reuben, after everything." "After everything," Reuben agreed, and there was wonder in his voice too. A big rough man gone soft and careful as he offered one finger for a chick to peck at. And Otis Granger, leaning in the barn doorway with his wife Millie beside him, exchanged a look that needed no words between two people who had known each other 40 years, and recognized exactly what they were watching take root in that lantern light. Cyrus Vane's trial, when it came in the spring at Fort Benton, was a quiet, thorough affair, the evidence too plain for any lawyer's cleverness to untangle, and he was sentenced to territorial prison for the shooting of Silas Cobb and the theft of the Grazing Association's herd, his ranch and much of his water claims reverting to the association, and through Dunmore's careful arrangement, a fair portion set aside to formalize the water rights of Larson's coulee once and for all. The very thing Silas Cobb had given his life trying to secure. Anders Larson himself rode to Cutbank Post the week after the verdict, bringing with him half his settlement and a wagon of good Norwegian bread and dried fish, to thank in person the surveyor's assistant and the male rider whose stubbornness had kept his community's name from ruin. And it was there, in front of Otis Granger's whole gathered town, that the last of the winter's suspicion finally thawed for good. "There were some among us," Otis Granger said that evening, standing before a crowd that filled the post's yard despite the cold, "who let a rich man's whispering turn us against a neighbor we'd known 20 years and a stranger we'd known only a season, and I count myself foremost among the fools who ought to be ashamed of that." Reuben Rhodes rode this route through weather that would have killed most men twice over, carried the truth through it when it would have been easier by far to look away. And Miss Barrett here walked into a stranger's cabin at midnight to save a dying man's life, and never once flinched afterward, not through gunfire, not through a whole town's cold shoulder, not through watching a home burn to the ground. I reckon this post owes them both an apology and a great deal besides, and I mean to start by saying that any man who's got a problem with the mail being carried by Reuben Rhodes, married or not, can take his letters to Helena and post them himself. "Married," Millie Granger repeated loudly, before either Reuben or Edith had said any such thing aloud to a living soul, and the crowd laughed, and Edith felt her face go hot, and looked sideways to find Reuben watching her with an expression that held no teasing in it at all. Only the same steady question he seemed to have been carrying since the night her eggs first hatched. Otis has a talent for saying things before a man's worked up the nerve to say them himself, Reuben said quietly, just to her, while the crowd's attention moved on to Anders Larsson's toast. But since it's already out in the yard for the whole post to hear, I don't suppose there's much use in me being shy about it now. Edith Barrett, I've built one cabin from nothing and I mean to build another, and I would consider myself the luckiest man in this territory if you'd agree to help me raise it as a home instead of just a roof, and stay in it besides, as my wife. Edith did not make him wait. I have followed one dead man's promise across half this territory and buried another home to a drought once already in my life, Reuben Rhodes. I am not in the habit of leaving good things behind twice. Yes. I will marry you, and gladly, though I will remind you that you still owe me a proper coop for these 11 chickens before you go building anything grander for the two of us. I have not forgotten, Reuben said, laughing, the sound of it rich and unguarded in a way few people at that gathering had ever heard from him before, and he kissed her again in front of the whole assembled post and Larsson's coolie both, and this time no one so much as pretended to look away, because by then there was not a soul in that yard, drought-worn and winter-weary as they all were, who did not understand exactly what they were watching, and wanted, every one of them, to see it succeed. They were married in March, in the last hard cold before the thaw properly broke, in a ceremony that filled Otis Granger's store from wall to wall, Larsson's coolie families seated alongside Cutbank Post regulars, who 6 months before would have crossed the street rather than speak to either bride or groom. A traveling circuit preacher pressed into service on his way through to Fort Benton, and Edith wore a dress Millie Granger had helped her sew from good blue wool. Plain and warm and practical exactly as she liked it, with a sprig of dried prairie sage tucked into her collar, because there had been no flowers to be found in that dry, late winter country, and she had declared, laughing, that sage would simply have to do the honor instead. Reuben spent the whole of that winter between the trials proceedings and the wedding's planning, rebuilding his cabin on the same foundation stones, a little larger this time, with a second window to let in more light and a proper stone chimney instead of the old tin flue. And he did all of it with his own 2 hands, felling the timber himself, notching each log with the same patience he had once given to reading trail sign, because he wanted, he told Edith, for every beam of it to be something he had built for her specifically, and not merely repaired out of habit. And true to the promise, he had made her the very first week they met, tucked among the last of the winter's work, standing a few respectful yards from the cabin's new porch, where the morning sun would reach it first, and the afternoon shade would keep it cool come summer, was a proper coop, real lumber and real wire mesh hauled up from Fort Benton at no small expense, with nesting boxes built low and roosts built high, and a little door that Reuben had carved, without telling her, with a small crude picture of a hen and 11 chicks scratched into the wood beside the latch. He finished it 3 days before the first green showed through the last patches of snow, and he brought Edith out to see it on a morning cold enough still to fog their breath, watching her face as she took in the whole of it, the careful joinery, the sturdy roof pitched to shed heavy snow, the fine mesh set deep enough into the ground to keep out foxes and weasels both. "You finished it," she said, and her voice caught in a way that told him more than any speech could have. "Before spring, just like you said you would that very first morning." "Told you I would," Reuben said, standing behind her with his big hands settled warm on her shoulders, watching 11 half-grown chickens tumble eagerly through the new door into their first proper home, scratching and clucking and settling themselves onto roosts built just for them. "A man keeps his word, Edith. Especially to the woman who taught him there was still something in this world worth building for." Edith turned in his arms to face him, the mountains rising pale and clean behind them, the drought's long dry summer still ahead but somehow less frightening now, faced as it would be together instead of alone, and she rose up to kiss him there in the cold morning light beside the coop he had built her, surrounded by the small, stubborn lives she had carried through fire and gunfire and grief to bring safely home. "Then I suppose," she said against his mouth, smiling, "that makes us square at last, Reuben Rhodes. You built me my coop before spring, exactly as promised, and I believe I have already given you back everything else worth having in return, whether you knew to ask for it or not." "I knew," Reuben said, and held her close as the first true thaw wind of the season came sighing down off Iron Joe Pass, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and coming green, the long dry year behind them at last, and a whole wide unclaimed future spread out ahead, waiting, the way the best country always did, for two people brave enough to build something lasting on it together.